Hollywood had a way of confusing calm with weakness, especially when the calm belonged to Marlon Brando. By the early 1950s, Brando's name carried weight, but not the kind that made rooms fall silent on its own. He wasn't a studio darling. He wasn't polished. He didn't trade in charm or fear. He carried himself like a man who didn't need permission to exist, and that unsettled people who built their power on intimidation. The night it happened wasn't on a movie set. It was a private dinner room tucked behind a popular Hollywood restaurant. Low lighting, red leather booths, heavy drapes meant to keep important conversations unheard. This was where deals were discussed quietly and lines were crossed carefully. Producers, fixers, and men who didn't appear in credits gathered here when they wanted privacy. Brando hadn't planned to stay long. He was there as a courtesy, invited by a producer who insisted it would be good to be seen. Brando disliked the phrase immediately. He sat at the table anyway, nursing a drink, listening more than he spoke. Across from him sat a man everyone recognized but no one named out loud. A mob-connected figure from the East Coast. Money in his pockets. Influence in his voice. The kind of man who laughed loudly to remind the room he could afford to. He wasn't there for business. He was there to be acknowledged. Conversation drifted. Movies. Politics. Power disguised as gossip. Brando stayed quiet. The mob boss noticed. Men like that always did. They sensed silence the way sharks sense blood. Not because it was weakness, but because it wasn't submission. The boss leaned back, swirling his drink, eyes flicking toward Brando with a half-smile. "So," he said casually, loud enough for the table to hear. "This is the big talent everyone's afraid of offending." A few men chuckled nervously. Brando didn't respond. The boss tilted his head. "You don't talk much, do you?" "I listen," Brando said. The calm in his voice irritated the man immediately. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't impressed. It was neutral. And neutrality denied hierarchy. The boss smiled wider. "That's smart," he said. "Listening keeps you alive." Brando met his gaze for the first time. So does knowing when to stop talking. The table went still. The producer who'd invited Brando shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the energy he wanted. He tried to redirect the conversation, but the boss waved him off. "I like this kid," the boss said, though his tone suggested the opposite. "Got attitude. Reminds me of my old neighborhood. Guys like him either go far or end up real quiet." Brando took a sip of his drink. The boss leaned forward now, elbows on the table. "Where are you from again?" "Nebraska," Brando said. "Huh," the boss laughed. "Middle America. Figures." He paused, then added almost lazily, "Your mother still alive?" The question landed heavier than it sounded. Brando didn't answer immediately. He studied the man's face, measuring intention. The boss took the silence as encouragement. "I hear she had issues," he continued, smirking. "Mental trouble, right? That must have been something. A mother like that messes a kid up." The laughter that followed was thin and uncertain. Everyone at the table knew what had just happened. This wasn't banter. This wasn't teasing. This was a deliberate test, a personal line crossed to see what kind of man Brando really was. Would he explode? Would he shrink? Would he try to laugh it off and keep his seat? Brando set his glass down gently. The sound was barely audible, but it cut through the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't glare. He didn't insult the man back. He simply said, "You don't know my mother." The boss shrugged. "I know enough." Brando leaned forward slightly, just enough to change the geometry of the table. "No," he said. "You know rumors. And you're confusing rumors with permission." The producer's face drained of color. The boss laughed again, louder this time. "Careful," he said. "You're getting sensitive." Brando nodded. "I am." That word hung in the air. Not getting. Not might be. Am. The boss's smile faded. "You threatening me?" Brando shook his head. "No." "Then what are you doing?" "I'm giving you a moment," Brando said calmly, "to decide whether you want to finish that line of conversation." The room went silent. No one had ever spoken to the boss like that without consequences. Not without posturing. Not without bravado. Brando wasn't challenging him the way men usually did. He wasn't trying to dominate. He was setting a boundary and standing inside it. The boss stared at him, searching for fear. He didn't find it. What happens if I don't? The boss asked. Brando's answer came without hesitation. Then this dinner ends, he said. And everyone here remembers why. A few men shifted in their seats. One of the boss's associates leaned closer, whispering something urgent into his ear. The boss ignored him. You think you're important enough to embarrass me? He asked. Brando's voice remained steady. I think you already embarrassed yourself. That was the moment the air changed. Not because Brando had insulted him, but because he'd refused to be impressed. The boss realized something then. Intimidation only worked when the other person wanted something from you. Brando wanted nothing. The boss leaned back slowly, eyes never leaving Brando's. A long moment passed. Too long. Then he smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. Relax, he said, raising his hands. Just joking. Brando didn't smile back. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, and looked around the table. I'm done, he said, not angrily, not dramatically. Enjoy your dinner. He turned and walked toward the exit. No one stopped him. Behind him, the boss watched in silence, his jaw tight, his authority unsettled by something far more dangerous than disrespect. A man who had drawn a line and walked away before anyone could push him back. The door closed softly behind Brando, and the room exhaled, unsure whether it had just witnessed restraint or the beginning of something that wouldn't end quietly. The silence Brando left behind was louder than the insult that started it. For several seconds after the door closed, no one spoke. The low hum of the restaurant returned slowly, cutlery clinking, muffled laughter from another room. But inside the private dining space, the air stayed tight. The mob boss was still smiling. It was the kind of smile men use when they didn't want witnesses to know they'd lost control. Someone finally laughed, too loudly, trying to reset the mood. Another man raised his glass as if nothing had happened. The producer who had invited Brando kept his eyes on the table, already calculating damage. The boss took a slow sip of his drink. Kid's got nerve, he said casually. No one agreed. No one contradicted him either. What unsettled the room wasn't that Brando had left. People stormed out of dinners all the time. What unsettled them was how he'd done it. Without anger, without apology, without waiting to see if anyone would stop him. Men like the boss were used to reactions. Fear, rage, desperation, bargaining. Brando had given him none of those. One of the boss's associates leaned in again. You want me to? The boss raised a finger. No. The word was soft but final. He stared at the door Brando had walked through, his expression unreadable. He didn't threaten me, he said slowly. Did you notice that? The associate nodded. He didn't insult me either, the boss continued. That's what bothers me. Across town, Marlon Brando walked alone down the sidewalk, the night air cool against his face. He didn't rush. He didn't look back. His pulse was steady. He knew exactly what he'd done, and he knew exactly what it might cost. He also knew something else. If he'd stayed, if he'd laughed, if he'd let the joke slide, the cost would have been far worse. Brando had learned early that humiliation never stopped on its own. It invited repetition. Tonight hadn't been about his mother, not really. It had been about whether he could be reduced in front of others. He'd answered that question. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. No calls. No reactions. No warnings. Hollywood had a way of letting tension stretch until you filled it yourself. Brando didn't. He went about his life as usual, reading scripts, rehearsing, working when there was work to do. Then the whispers started. Not threats. Not confrontations. Questions. People asked carefully what had happened at the dinner. Who'd been there? What was said? Brando didn't elaborate. He didn't dramatize it. He told the truth in the fewest words possible and left it there. The story spread anyway. It always did. But it changed as it traveled. By the time it reached studio offices, the punchline wasn't the insult. It was the response. The calm. The way Brando had stood up, ended the night, and walked out without waiting for permission. Executives didn't know what to make of it. Some were irritated. He should have smoothed it over, one said. Why provoke people like that? Others were uneasy for a different reason. He didn't provoke, another replied. He shut it down. That distinction mattered. The mob boss heard the version too. The one where Brando hadn't raised his voice, hadn't insulted him, had simply refused to be impressed. That version traveled back east, stripped of Hollywood glamour, reduced to its core. A man crossed the line. Another man told him quietly to stop, and walked away. That kind of story lingered. Weeks passed. Nothing happened. No retaliation. No warning. No mysterious obstacles placed in Brando's path. If anything, doors opened more easily. Meetings resumed. Work continued. People began to understand. The boss hadn't let it go out of kindness. He'd let it go because escalation would have required admitting something he didn't want to admit, that the exchange had rattled him, that the calm refusal had stripped him of the advantage intimidation usually gave him. A man who wasn't afraid to leave had nothing to bargain with. And men like that were unpredictable in the worst way. Months later, Brando ran into the producer again at a studio event. The man looked relieved to see him. "I thought you might have." He stopped himself, choosing his words carefully. "I'm glad nothing came of it." Brando studied him. "Something did come of it." The producer frowned. "What?" "I don't have to laugh at jokes that cost me my dignity," Brando said. "That came of it." The producer nodded slowly, as if hearing the sentence for the first time in his life. The incident was never written about, never confirmed, never denied. It lived where the most important Hollywood stories lived, in memory, in tone, in the way people adjusted themselves around certain names. Brando noticed it. Men were more careful with him after that. Not warmer, not friendlier, but more precise. Jokes stayed surface level. Lines weren't crossed casually. Respect didn't arrive loudly. It arrived as restraint. Years later, when Brando was older and the mythology around him had hardened into legend, someone asked him why he never responded with anger when people tested him. "Anger gives them what they want," he said. "Control." He paused, then added, "Silence makes them think." The dinner became one of those stories people told quietly, usually late, usually after a drink or two. It was never framed as a confrontation. It was framed as a moment. The moment someone powerful expected submission and didn't get it. The moment a joke stopped being funny. The moment calm proved stronger than menace. Brando never revisited it publicly. He didn't need to. The outcome spoke for itself. The boss kept his distance. The industry adjusted its tone. And Brando carried on unchanged. That was the part Hollywood never quite understood. He hadn't won anything that night. He protected something. And once protected, it stayed with him for the rest of his life. A mob boss had made a joke about Marlon Brando's mother. His calm response shocked everyone. Not because it was clever, but because it ended the story exactly where it needed to end, with dignity intact.